Please give a warm and heartfelt welcome this evening to the keynote speaker and the man who really, literally wrote the book, Taking a Stand, Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Congratulations, George. I know what it's like to be an aspiring poet. And I've discovered through the years that my wife really likes my poetry, but she also likes necklaces and bracelets. So I would suggest accompanying the poem with maybe a tangible item now and again. But in fact, in my book, which you're all going to get a copy of, I wrote a poem, and I thought it was a splendid poem for my wife. And I didn't get one person, I think, that read it or commented on it. So if anybody wants to read the inscription to my wife, I would appreciate that. And if you want to write something nice online about what a great poet I am, my head will be getting really big. Now, I love being here with the Kansas Policy Institute. I'm associated with the one in Kentucky, Bluegrass Policy Institute. I know Larry, and Larry has come and spoken to our interns. And when I think of the Policy Institute, I can't help but think of John Maynard Keynes. And you say, now what does John Maynard Keynes have to do with the Policy Institute? You think, no way they're related, right? Well, I think of his comment. He's the godfather of deficit spending, of no restraint, of big government, right? And they ask him, well, you know, the monetary stimulus, it helps in the beginning, but what about the long run? He said, well, in the long run, we'll all be dead. But I think this is a room of people who believe that the long run's important, that it is important what we do for our kids. It is important the future of the nation. It's important that the nation that's the richest, freest, most humanitarian nation, that this experiment continue. And that each generation that we fight to make sure that it continues. Now, some will say that in politics, you guys don't get along, there's such incivility, and you're at each other's throat, it's so partisan. Can't you just hold hands and sing Kumbaya and everything will be right? There are some people who just believe that we're not as civil as we once were. They need to reread their history of what's on in Congress. When I showed up, they gave me a desk, and I sit at Henry Clay's desk. And I didn't know this even existed. The desks are passed down in certain states. So Mississippi, there's a Jefferson Davis desk. It has a few blemishes. The Union soldiers came in and stuck a bayonet through it. But it goes to the Mississippi senator. The Robert Kennedy desk goes to somebody from New York, and I've got the Henry Clay desk. So I've been reading up about Henry Clay and wondering if it was a lot more civil back when he was there. So he was one of the first speakers of the House. He was elected in 1808, first time in Congress. Is Mike still here? First term, he gets elected speaker. Mike, what have you been doing? So he immediately gets elected speaker, but it's a rough place. I mean, the Derringer had just been invented. People walked around with their Derringers. People had canes, and they were pretty vicious with their canes. And there was one guy who was a piss pot. He was a bad dude, John Randolph of Roanoke. And he had his big hunting dogs in there. And you think, oh, they're just Labrador retrievers, no big deal, right? He was said to describe his dogs this way. A debt collector came to his house, and he said to the debt collector, he says, if it weren't for your genteel ways, my dogs would have torn you to pieces. But he insisted on bringing his dogs to the floor, and the former Speaker of the House was afraid of him and wouldn't make him leave. A congressman from North Carolina tried to tell him that you need to get those damn dogs off the floor. He beat him over the head with his cane. There's other famous caning instances on the floor. It was a rough place. So people who say, oh, it's so incivil, there's such incivility in Washington, need to read their history. So Henry Clay gets to be speaker in his first term, and he tells the sergeant at arms, get those damn dogs off the floor. So he did. They took him out, and as he goes out, there's John Randolph standing at the door, and he bows up and he says, I never sidestep a skunk. Henry Clay says, I always do. And he walked out. And so you think, well, maybe they had a fist fight, or maybe they got over it, or maybe they made up. 16 years later, Henry Clay's run for president in 1824, but Andrew Jackson gets the popular vote, but it gets thrown into the House. So nobody has a majority of electoral votes. So it's in the House, and Henry Clay throws his support to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams ends up winning. John Randolph of Roanoke no longer with his dogs, is unhappy. And so what he says about Henry Clay is he says that he made a corrupt bargain and he's nothing more than a blackleg. I didn't know what that meant, but apparently a blackleg's not a good thing to be. It's someone who cheats at cards. And Henry Clay was known for drinking, maybe a little bit of womanizing, and playing cards, but he says he did not cheat at the cards. So he was very mad. He challenged Randolph to a duel. This wasn't Henry Clay's first duel. It was his second duel. He became famous in the Kentucky legislature with his first duel. So really a duel wasn't that bad a thing. Although it's illegal in Kentucky, still illegal. I have to take an oath of office as I have not fought in a duel, and I promise not to fight in a duel. I'm not kidding you. I'm not making this up. So they crossed the Ohio River to make it legal. They went over into, I think, Indiana and had their duel. That was the first one. But now John Randolph has insulted him and said that he got to be Secretary of State for John Quincy Adams by this corrupt bargain, and he cheats at cards. So they challenged him to a duel, and John Randolph was known for being a bit eccentric. He showed up in his flowing morning gown. You know, the big gowns men used to wear. It's like this full thing, I guess so he would maybe not see where he was to shoot him beneath the gown. So Henry Clay fires 2 bullets at him, and they, of course, they miss. They go through the evening gown or the morning gown, whatever you call it, and he's got these holes in his gown but doesn't get hit. And you think, well, isn't this the Henry Clay they call the Great Compromiser? He's having duels, he's fighting with people, he's mixing it up on the House floor. But he became known as this Great Compromiser. So I get there and they give me his desk, and I didn't really run exactly on that platform. And so I get there, and one of the senators, he looks at me and he smiles and has a little twinkle in his eye, and he says, "Are you going to be a great compromiser now that you're here?" And I thought, well, that's a good question. Maybe we should analyze or figure out what it means to compromise. And so I decided in my first speech on the House floor, or the Senate floor, to talk about maybe the difference between Henry Clay and Cassius Clay. Now, Cassius Clay was Henry's cousin, and he was a great abolitionist, and the fighter was named after Cassius Clay. Muhammad Ali was named Cassius Clay when he was born, but after the great abolitionist. Both Cassius and Henry were slave owners, but they sort of had different approaches. Henry was always sort of the down the middle, tried to please a little bit of the abolitionists, tried to please a little bit of the slave owners. He always took the middle course. So he never freed his slaves. Even when he died, he didn't free his slaves. Cassius Clay, on the other hand, was a big landowner, and he freed his slaves while he was alive and printed a newspaper advocating for emancipation. But it was not without risks to be an emancipationist or an abolitionist in those days. People were very, very bitter and very, very, actually you've heard of that in Kansas, I guess. But the thing is, he had this newspaper and he knew it was a danger, and so he had a cannon in the front hall. If you came through the door, you got blasted with a cannon. And then he had loaded rifles in all the different windows in order to protect this. He was known to give a lot of fire and brimstone in his speeches, and so he'd put his Bible here and he'd put his Bowie knife here. One of his biographers said that his weapons of choice were his pen and his Bowie knife, and he was so good with the former that he often had recourse to the latter. One time he was coming home from a meeting, an abolition meeting, I think near Lexington, and as he was coming home, he was jumped by Squire Turner and his boys, and they were slave traders. And they began pummeling him and stabbing him. They've got him on the ground, they've taken his knife. And Tom Turner, the son of Squire Turner, takes the gun, puts it point blank to his head, and fires 3 times. Fortunately, the guns didn't always work back then. And he misfired all 3 times, at which time Cassius Clay grabs the blade of the knife with his hand, cutting his hand to the bone, gets the knife back from him, stabs Tom Turner in the stomach, guts him, and kills him. The rest of them ran off. I tell you this story to say that I would say that's sort of an uncompromising approach. I think Cassius Clay has decided compromise he's not going to be the great compromiser. We contrast this with Henry Clay. And if you read your history books, and I'm guessing there are a few people here who don't always believe everything they were taught in school. There are variations on history, and there are different opinions about history, but almost everybody loves Henry Clay. And it's dangerous for me to be telling you this story because I am from Kentucky. But I think we could also question whether or not compromise saved the Union, or whether or not the compromises of Henry Clay ensured that there would be a civil war and that there would be this horrible disaster. I'm not saying he's the cause for the Civil War, but I'm saying, maybe these things that people said were great compromises and everybody lauded him for, maybe they weren't that great. Maybe there's some things you shouldn't compromise. Maybe the principle of a human owning another human is something that shouldn't have been compromised, even in those days. Everything was splitting the difference. We'll be half free, half slave. Nebraska can be free and Kansas will be slave. Missouri will be slave and the others will be free. But we'll be half and half. And that'll sort of keep the peace. He continued through his life, Henry Clay, to support the Fugitive Slave Act. He continued to support even the slave trade in D.C. So the question is that are there certain things you should compromise on, maybe certain things you shouldn't? Even if you think, keeping the country together is a good idea, maybe there are certain principles even above and beyond that are so important that you don't compromise them. And I think the contrast is incredibly important because every day you were told by the media that we do not compromise enough. You were told that if we would just compromise and split the difference down the middle, that we would be so much better off in the country and we get so much done. Gridlock would end, heavens would open up, and we would have manna from heaven. Everything would be perfect. We just compromise. I think it's the opposite. I think we compromise too much. And the thing is if you look at Washington, the dirty little secret of Washington is they compromise every day. And who's compromising? Those who want to spend your money, those who want to borrow your money, and they're on the right and the left. The right has been the loudest voices for more spending in our country in the last 5 years. When we got to Washington after the Tea Party Revolution of 2010, when I was elected, we had like 60 some odd new members in the House. We had 6 or 7 new Republicans in the Senate, and we were ambitious and we said, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling unless we have significant budgetary reform. Some of us introduced that. This is still my rule. I'll vote to raise the debt ceiling if they'll pass a constitutional amendment saying we have to balance the budget. At the same time, in the same piece of legislation, we cap spending and say, well, from now on, we're going to balance the budget. We're not going to have these enormous 2,000-page bills that nobody reads. That's when I'll vote to raise the debt ceiling. We didn't get that. But we ended up getting something they called the sequester. At the time, I voted against it because I didn't think it was enough. But over time, I came to think that, it's actually working a little bit. And you know what the sequester was? Most people have no clue what the sequester was. In fact, Jimmy Kimmel did Man on the Street, which should scare the hell out of you. He went out and he said to people on the street, he said, you've heard that President Obama has banned the sequester and sent it to North Korea. And people were like, damn right, they deserve it. Nobody has any idea what it was, but everybody hated it. But the loudest haters were Republicans. They said, we don't have enough military spending. We've got to have more military spending. But you know what the facts are? Since 9/11, military spending in real terms has gone up by 50%. The people who say there's no money for the military aren't paying attention. Now, you could argue that there wasn't enough freedom to the Pentagon to move around where they cut things, and I actually was for that. Give them more leeway to make the cuts. But there's no way we can't survive as a country when we spend more than the next 10 countries combined on military that we couldn't survive a itty-bitty wee cut in the military spending. And guess what? The sequester wasn't a cut. When you looked at it over 10 years, here's the spending curve. There's no flat line up there. It's going up 5% a year at least. Here we're spending under the sequester. Still going up. It was a slowdown in the rate of growth of government. But it was still better than nothing. And when I started to worry that the Tea Party revolution was dying on the vine and that all of the people, hundreds of thousands of people turned out at rallies in 2009. They wanted to take their government back. I was part of that wave of people who came to Washington, and I started to wonder, have we completely given up? Are we just going to throw in the towel? Because the right wanted more for military. The only way they can get it? They've got to give the left the welfare money. So it's both. Both sides get what they want. And so you ask yourself, is compromise good? I don't know. If you're a taxpayer, Or if you think the debt is bad, maybe that kind of compromise isn't good. But could there be another compromise? Sure. The concept of trying to reconcile differences with people is not necessarily bad, but you got to compromise at least in the right direction. So, I mean, if we were to say to both the right and the left, we're borrowing $1 million a minute, we have a $20 trillion debt. As Admiral Mullen said, the biggest threat to our national security is our debt. If we were to acknowledge all of that, we might be stronger. Our military might be stronger. We might be stronger as a country if we weren't bankrupt. And maybe both sides, maybe the right and the left would say, you know what? We both value what we're for, but because we value the country more, we're going to agree to gradually reduce the spending for both. That's the kind of compromise. Compromise is going to have to be in the right direction. But then there are some things that I think we should not compromise on. I would call this the Bill of Rights. I would call this natural liberty, our natural rights. Many of us believe come from our Creator. These are things you shouldn't compromise. Your speech, your ability to assemble, your ability to, practice your religion, your ability to have gun ownership, your ability to be left alone, you shouldn't compromise on those. And we've been compromising for a long, long time. If you look when it started, part of the problem was we divided liberty in half. We said we're going to have economic liberty and personal liberty. We're going to have economic liberty, but it's always going to be secondary, and it's going to be second tier. And if anybody can imagine, any court or any regulator or any government official can imagine a rational need for regulating a business, it's fine. So we began regulating everything, and economic liberty became greatly diminished from the Great Depression on. Now the court said we're going to protect some rights, and we're going to call them fundamental. Equal protection under the law, due process, speech, they were a little better on. But really, I don't think we've done a good job really of protecting our rights in either sphere. As we've looked at the battles over the last couple of years that I've been there, one of the biggest battles that I got involved with was saying that you have a right to be left alone, that you have a right to communicate with your neighbors and your friends and your family without the government looking at that information, without the government collecting that information. This is a big deal to me, because if you look at the revolution and you say, why did we fight the revolution, and which one of the amendments made the colonists, made the Americans the maddest, what got their blood boiling, what made them want to separate from the mother country and risk life and limb, it was soldiers coming in their house. It was writs of assistance, it was generalized warrants that made them hopping mad enough to fight the king. Taxes may have been part of it, but they didn't really worry about like the right to bear arms. I think the Second Amendment does have to do with individual right to bear arms. I don't think they were worried that a government was necessarily going to take it, particularly for ownership. They thought they might come and try to shut down the militia and have shut down self-defense. But the thing is, they did worry about the Fourth Amendment, and they wrote the amendment to say that if the government wants to come in your house, they have to have an individualized warrant. Your name has to be on it. They have to say what they want. And they have to have probable cause that you've either committed a crime or are going to commit a crime. There was a significant standard to keep the government out of your house. But we've gotten it wrong. This isn't a recent phenomenon. In 1928, the Olmstead case rules that your phone conversations are not private. So from 1928 to 1968, your phone conversations were not private. They were not considered yours. They were considered, you gave them up. You decided to speak, and therefore you had no privacy interested in your phone conversations. But there was a great jurist back then who wrote a dissent that people still quote, Brandeis. Brandeis said that the most cherished right of civilized men and women is the right to be left alone. And this is an important thing, because some conservatives will say, well, there's no right to privacy in the Constitution, so you don't have it. This is where I've become a big fan of Randy Barnett and others who argue that your rights don't have to be enumerated. In fact, they explicitly said this in the Ninth Amendment, those rights not listed are not to be disparaged. I ran into Scalia one time before he died, and I laughed, not over his passing, but I laughed over the conversation. We were at a cocktail party, and sometimes maybe I'm still like I'm in college. I'm a little overeager to go to the professor and say what's on my mind. And so I went up to him and I started talking about, what Randy Barnett's talked about and others about, rights don't have to be enumerated and that we do have a right to privacy, et cetera, et cetera. He said, which rights are we disparaging? And so the conversation together, I think he went to the bar to get another drink or something. He left me. But I think it's an important concept. And it kind of separates sometimes conservatives and libertarians. You remember in the debate between Romney and others, they asked him about the Griswold case. And at the time, I didn't remember the case, but I looked it up. And the Griswold case was about whether or not you can ban birth control. Connecticut had banned birth control, and the Supreme Court reversed it by saying that people do have a right to privacy. I think it is important to understand, for example, right to private property. It's not really spelled out that well in the Constitution. Some of them wanted it to be more in there, and it says the government can't take your property without just compensation. But the right to private property is not listed, but they certainly thought you had it. So I think it is important that we discuss these concepts, that we continue to battle over these concepts. We don't have to have hunting dogs on the House floor to do it. But I think it is important that we understand that there are certain things you shouldn't compromise over. Now, if you ask me what should be the age of eligibility for Social Security, or what should be your tax rate, we can split the difference on some of those things, as long as I think we're going in the right direction. But I think you can split the difference on some numbers. You can split some difference on the day-to-day function of government. But when I look at my job description, and every day I think about what I'm supposed to be doing, it isn't in my job description to transfer wealth from half of you to the other half. It isn't in my job description to do even really concrete things. What is in my job description is an abstraction, but it is an abstraction that people put their life on the line for and have through the centuries. And this abstraction is liberty. The abstraction of being left alone, the abstraction of saying, these are mine naturally, and it is my job as your representative in Congress to protect that. As we go forward, I'm going to continue to understand that that's the cause I fight for, the cause I fight for every day, and the cause that we all are joined in. And I hope you want to be part of that cause, and I'm glad to be here this evening. Thank you very much.